Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. That's right, I am on camera for once, and unless you're listening to the audio version of this will be the first time I'm actually talking to you via video, which is definitely fun. Not something I'm going to do all the time, sorry, but in case you don't know who I am, my name is John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author and professional editor with over 10 years of experience, not just as an editor, but as a writer too. And I've always wanted to do something with video for sure, but I've kind of held back just because it is a lot to do. It takes a lot of time. But I figured we could do something a little bit different for this episode today, actually, because we got an email from a listener and there was a lot of stuff in it. And I think it would work better if I used video via the YouTube channel and all that stuff to actually post it in a way where you can see what they're talking about. And hopefully this will be something we can do from time to time as well. Maybe even with interviews, we'll see. But for now, if you are listening to the audio version, I'm going to do my best, of course, to make this work so that if you're only listening and that's how you're used to the show, you can still appreciate everything I'm talking about without having to rely on any visual stuff as well. So with all that said, now normally on the show, what I usually do is I read an advice prompt from one of our producers, Natalia Emmons, and I react to it live. I have looked at this, but I haven't used brain power or anything. I just kind of perused the email, and the email had a bunch of questions on it. And it was from a listener of the show, Vinny Theory. And they had at the very end of it, this here's the big, most important question. So I was like, okay, then I'll do that, because if it's the big, most important question, we're going to start with that. And then maybe we'll do other things via their email along a later time. Maybe we'll see. So I have kind of a vague sense. I think I read the first few words, but again, as soon as I saw it, I was like, all right, I'm going to plan this recording and then we're going to do everything. And then I'm going to process what they're asking, and then we'll go from there. So it can at least be more engaging. I could prep for that kind of thing, but I think the issue is that whenever I prep something, I feel like I just don't do as well. I feel like off the cuff, I have an easier time avoiding the problem of overthinking something. So hopefully I'm not going to overthink this one anyway. But yes, without further ado, let's get into it. Actually, here's a little bit of extra ado that I don't want to forget. I do want to announce that, well, first of all, if you like the show and you want to support us, Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, you can check out, first of all, you can leave a review and a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever you like. If you haven't done that already, thank you if you have. But also, you can send us an advice prompt. We want to hear from you like this listener did with their email. Would love to react to more people within the community, not just folks who maybe post something on subreddits or the Discord or what have you. So if that is you and you have a question, we are getting more stuff that's coming in. And so I'm trying to keep track, and producer Natalia is also helping with that as well. And I'm always kind of sending both Natalia and our other producer, Bridget, kind of here are some comments that are rolling in. And so we are aware of everything that's coming, and hopefully we can do another episode too soon where we can do a grab bag, since a lot of this stuff tends to vary in terms of the topics. A lot of them are reactions to previous episodes and all that. So, but if you have if you have something specific, you have something that you really want to get across that you feel like we haven't had the space for, we haven't talked about yet, definitely want to hear that from you. fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com is the way to do that. And that's of course linked in the show notes. So you can check that out and hit us up whenever you want. And real quick, I did also want to plug something that we just launched this past week, or I just launched, which is technically I've had this for a while. A few months ago, I set up a Substack for the first time because I realized that my mailing list on my website was inactive, and all the subscribers I had, I didn't realize that I had lost access to it. So I'm very upset about that. So what I did is I set up a Substack that is going to essentially be my new mailing list for my website. And also it's going to be a place where I can publish and post any of my short stories that I'm either not submitting because I'm just writing them. I'm not really writing them with intent to submit, or because they've been rejected for whatever reason. And so I just published the first short story yesterday. I'm recording this on Monday, January 13th. So I posted it yesterday, and this was a short story I wrote a year and a half ago. And it's funny because I told myself I would never release it or show it to anybody, but then I just did it anyway. So I can actually share that with you now. If you're watching the video, you can see the website, but it's called Cetera. That's the name of the actual website that I set up, the Substack that I set up. And this is the first short story that I published. It's called To Feel Like a Person Again, a haunting tale of love, loss, and the hopeless desire to do it all over again. And this is essentially like a ghost story romance. It's a short story that I wrote because I wanted to dip my hand in some dark academia for the first time, like really give it a shot and see if I liked it. And it's kind of dark academia. It's really kind of different though. It's a little bit more of a meditative piece and it's very voicey. I'm really proud of it. I think that it turned out pretty well. But if you want to read it for yourself, or if you want to be aware of any of the stuff I'm doing short story wise and just kind of get a sense of like, how does John follow or break his own rules that he talks about on the show? This is the place where you can give me the business and call me out, because there are all kinds of times when I'm like looking through my stuff and I'm like, I need to practice what I preach better for sure. But of course, that's the beauty of short stories, is that you can experiment, you can try breaking some rules here and there, and you can get those really good feedback reminders from folks on, oh yeah, you know what? This is something I struggle with, before you actually jump into the very deep waters of writing a novel and committing a ton of time. So as always, I highly recommend getting into short stories. If you don't already, it's a wonderful way to improve and refine your work. But with that, I'm going to switch this over to our email that we got from Vinny Theory. So Vinny Theory has been listening for a while. Vinny kind of comes in with comments pretty regularly. So love hearing from them. And I think we have it right here. Here we go. Okay. So I just took the email because it was a longer email and I just put it into a Google Doc here. So that's what you're looking at. So Vinny3 writes, and you can follow along, of course, on the YouTube channel. Vinny writes, big/most important question. So as I was referring to before, this is at the end. And so this is the thing they wanted me to talk about the most. All right. So what makes a story maximally commercial/marketable? In other words, what are the patterns between all the stories that become iconic in the eyes of the general public, i.e., Harry Potter, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Percy Jackson, Hunger Games, Twilight, Dune, etc.? And they also write, for context, I've asked many YouTubers this question and no one will answer it, claiming that no one knows. But that's simply not true. I myself have even detected many of the patterns your story needs, and they do a list here. I don't want to get into the list yet. I do want to evaluate what they have to say about this, but first, I kind of want to react to it myself. So we're going to do that. And I'll start by saying this. When I was studying mass media in college, I had a major in advertising and public relations when I was an undergrad. And I had this class that was very influential. It's actually that class, I'm still friends with my professor from that class because it's the reason that I started blogging. It's the reason I started writing. It was a class dedicated to understanding why things kind of take off. And for context, this was like 2010, 2011. And this is around the time where YouTube videos had been going viral. Like we were kind of seeing like viral internet stuff happen like in the early stages. So it's 2011, right? So it's been like a few years since Facebook memes started becoming more of a thing. Twitter was launched in like 2007. We were starting to get like a cultural understanding of like this thing pops off on the internet and everybody is talking about it. That was still fairly new when I was in school. And we had this like whole class that was talking about why some, for example, commercials will succeed. They'll generate lots of conversation. We talked about Super Bowl ads. And we try to figure out like what is the common denominator between all of these things that seem to just like take off with the public, that capture people's fascination. And the thing that Vinny Theory actually said here about like no one knows, I think the reason a lot of people say that is because in reality, like there are times when it should be successful. Like you have an advertising campaign, you have a movie, you have something that has all the elements that you would think would make it popular, that people would react to and all this stuff, but then nobody cares, or it just doesn't take off for whatever reason. And so it's sort of relegated to this, oh yeah, it's mysterious, it's ambiguous, you never know. There's like a secret recipe to it that just nobody can crack the code. You can only just do your best. And I understand and sympathize with an element of that in the sense that you can't fully, like it's not a science all the time. I mean, sometimes you are going to do your best and it is going to hit the marks, but it's still not going to take off because usually it's a combination of things. You know, usually you can do your best and you can have everything in the right spot, but if the timing of its release is wrong, or if you don't market it the right way, or if it just has a fundamental flaw that you overlooked, there are all kinds of variables. And if you try to just push yourself to always get it perfect, then it can be an issue. It can definitely be one of those things where you, like I was saying before, you overthink it. or you're trying so hard to make something all things to all people to hit all those marks that it just ends up being a middling mess. It doesn't have a unique vision, all of this. And so it's tough. It's hard to force the recipe of success on something, because a lot of the time when you chase that success and you try to chase what's been successful, you just end up creating something a little bit soulless that doesn't really have anything to it that's going to resonate with people. Now, all that said, I do believe that there is a fundamental universal thing behind these stories that Vinny Theory has kind of just like laid out here. And I'll try to explain it this way. So have you ever noticed, make sure I'm explaining this right. Have you ever noticed how like these stories do need to really like take off, like they have to feel fresh and familiar at the same time. I think I've talked about this before a few times, actually. You have to have something that does feel original, but it has to have an element of something that people can relate with. It's like how a story can tap into something that, we intuitively already know, but in a way we've never quite seen before. And let's take Harry Potter, for example. It is a typical, almost kind of cliched chosen one tale, which a lot of people can criticize for various reasons of like, well, how many chosen one tales do we get? We get so many, but people still love that story. But part of the reason its sort of tropey setup doesn't get lambasted as much is because, well, it's set in a magical school with wands. It has Quidditch. It has these like houses, and it's old stuff. It's stuff that we've readily recognize in a story, but it's presented in a way that feels new, almost feels completely new. So if you take like Hunger Games is another good example. I really like Hunger Games as an example because it reimagines the whole concept of gladiators, but through a dystopian lens. And then it subverts it even further by making it a teenage protagonist. And then it goes even further. It's like, not only is this a teenage protagonist, all these things against them, they are not only just fighting to survive, to make it through the story, but they're also fighting against an oppressive system. And I think one of the reasons these stories tend to succeed is because they anchor us in something that is recognizable, but then they surprise us with a bold, creative twist. And honestly, again, at the heart of this is relatability, plausibility. Like you can really understand why this story should resonate. A story that resonates because it's exploring universal themes that a lot of us can relate to, like love, identity, power struggles, the classic kind of good versus evil setup or battle, right? And these stories tend to do all this stuff through characters and conflicts that do still feel deeply personal. They think about Katniss in Hunger Games again. Katniss isn't just like a rebel. She's not a rebel just for the sake of it, right? Like she's just trying to protect her family. She's trying to protect her sister. If you take Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, he's not just fighting the Empire. He's wrestling with all kinds of things. His identity, he's wrestling with his destiny, especially in the second two movies. The first movie, it's about him trusting the Force. That's the major character arc. And it's something that connects with the audience being like, okay, this is the audience's first time being like, here's the Force. They're in the same boat as Luke. And there's a feeling of satisfaction and victory when we trust the Force right alongside Luke, and he decides to use that to make the shot and blow up the Death Star. That's why that works. It wouldn't work if out of nowhere the successful thing is he just shoots it and then they win. You'd be like, well, that's kind of a letdown. What was the struggle? Where was the culmination of the story itself? And overall, I just think that these characters, as they face different challenges, yes, the challenges are fantastical and they reflect struggles that we understand, but also the stakes are going to be high. They're going to be on a grand scale. That's the beauty of fantasy, right? All this stuff is great, but ultimately it comes down to the emotional core. The emotional core is what's going to hook us. I know I've talked before about how in your first few pages, it's all about getting you emotionally invested in the main character. If you don't do that, then nothing else is really going to matter for most readers. You can have this beautiful, lush world with all this great exposition and description, all this cool stuff. But if I don't care about the character in the sense that I don't feel emotionally invested in what's going to happen to them, either good or ill, because they could be a bad person, they could be a wonderful person or something in between. If I'm not emotionally invested in what's going to take them to the next scene and what's going to change for them in the next scene, then I'm going to plug out. I'm just not going to feel like I want to be in this world with that character. I want good company. I want good characters. So another thing to pay attention to is the actual world building, because this is a fantasy podcast and world building is so important. And with world building, I think a fresh angle, if you're looking for that kind of thing, you want to be super original. You want your world to be new and exciting and for people to feel like they haven't been there before. You want it to feel like the world is vivid, that again, it's original, but also it's layered with details that make it feel plausible. Details that put me in this world in a way where I don't feel like it's so alien that I don't feel like it could exist. And I want this world to feel alive. So look at Dune. So Dune was mentioned. So that's a sci-fi epic, but it's also a story that's about ecology. It's a story about very complicated politics. And the thing that kind of puts it all together is the actual human spirit. So Dune can be this very weird world where spices are a whole thing and weird stuff happens sometimes. But I'm always in it because I think that emotional core, that human spirit of what drives all the politicking around the spices, it's always present. You always feel it and you always understand why I'm here and why I should care, because here's what's at stake for the characters I care about. Let's take Percy Jackson, because I think that was mentioned too. Percy Jackson's cool. I mean, it reinvents Greek mythology, but for, kids in a contemporary setting. And you can kind of have this like very, awe-inspiring or awesome sort of like, ooh, Greek gods, that's super cool. But also we're in a world where this is a world I recognize, right? Like, oh, it's New York, smartphones and all that stuff. It's been a while since I read any of the books, but I don't really know how much they actually dive into the contemporary stuff. But you understand that it's a world that I recognize. Like I see this world different from Harry Potter in the sense that Harry Potter almost always just in Hogwarts, which is very like timeless, out of time and all that. Percy Jackson is more of its time. And that's sort of the point of the story. So that's another example of taking something that's kind of fresh, which is, it's okay. It's like Greek mythology, but the children, like the half gods of like Greek, mythological gods, but in a setting that we recognize and we feel like we can put ourselves in it. And again, all this stuff needs that emotional core. It needs that thing that's kind of tying us into why the characters are here and why we should care about them. And I think these worlds, they draw us in because, well, first of all, they tend to be richly imagined. They're not just like places that feel like, I don't know, a checklist or feel like a world where it's like very perfunctory and like, I don't want to be here. I mean, think of Hogwarts. I understand, like Harry Potter, it's tough to like Harry Potter these days because it hasn't aged super well. But I think that one of the reasons it took off the way it did is because people wanted to be in Hogwarts. Like people wanted to be in those different schools. They wanted to like exist in a world where magic is possible. And these were just richly imagined worlds. It had a sense of discovery. Every time you're going through Hogwarts, it's like you're discovering a new place in it. There was the mystery angle of it. And so that also aided the sense of discovery. And I think that like as you explore these different worlds and you want to explore these different worlds, like you want to explore the world in Percy Jackson because, well, what would the world be like if Greek gods were real? And how would that affect the contemporary setting we understand, right? And it's fun in those stories to be like, oh, here are some new rules. Here are some kind of different details that are really intriguing and they are layered throughout the entire plot. So you always feel like you're in a good fantasy setting. You're exploring the world alongside the characters. Song of Ice and Fire very much is like this as well. Because everywhere you're going in Westeros and Essos, it has its own kind of built-in world that feels so figured out. And it has so much detail and description to it. It just feels like you're traveling to a new place. And that's why a lot of people love fantasy, is because that's just such an exciting thing to do as a reader. But I do think, like here's the actual kicker. All of these stories I'm talking about, they tend to bring their originality into a very sharp focus with actual symbols and aesthetics and moments that are extremely memorable, that you can just kind of like quickly understand. Like I hesitate to call it branding, but you can like immediately sort of understand the world based on one symbol. So for example, Hunger Games. Okay, so the Mockingjay pin. The Mockingjay pin is iconic, right? You can immediately be like, that's Hunger Games. The One Ring from Lord of the Rings. You're immediately like, yes. A lot of stories tend to miss this. I've noticed this a lot when I read stuff that's submitted to me, even short stories too. But I'm like, there's nothing that I can grab onto in a tangible way that I understand the story through this one symbol. And that is such a great shorthand for making your story feel alive, feel like it has something it's resting its hat on. So hopefully a lot of you too are going to be like, oh yes, this is my version of a lightsaber that I have that makes my story really stand out because it summarizes everything in like one kind of cool fixture that makes my fantasy story such that people will be in this world and want more of this thing, and the symbol kind of spider webs into all these cool corners and places. So yeah, I'd say that you want something like that. You want something that's easy to share, that's memorable, that iconically pins your story in place. And you also want this stuff to matter too. Like you want to write a story that has themes. We've talked about themes on this show before. You can't force a good theme. A lot of folks will, myself included, will recommend that you don't overthink theme before you really draft the story itself. You should probably just kind of start with the story and start with something kind of personal, put characters through certain situations, let the themes kind of organically come about on their own. And then when you're editing, maybe tighten up those themes and make them more pronounced as you see fit, right? But there are times when I'm writing and I feel like I'm feeling a mood, something's going on in the world. There's like a cultural event happening, current events, political stuff. And I'm just feeling like I'm in my feelings. I'm feeling like the world is a certain way, and it's going to edge out into my writing or bleed into my writing. It's going to start showing up. And whenever I notice this, I try really hard to lean into it, because it can fade very quickly. And there are a lot of stories we've talked about already that the timing of when they came out is so key. Lord of the Rings came out. Tolkien was, of course, really using it as a way to process World War II or World War I, one of those. And I think it was World War II. But he genuinely was just kind of trying to tell the story of like going off to war and what that means, like what happens to the Shire when they return in the books, not the movies. But then also understanding that like how war truly changes you, how violence truly changes you. And all those things are so impactful and resonant of a specific cultural mood that was going on when he published The Lord of the Rings. And there are all kinds of things that we can do now in our current time. There are themes that you can harp upon, such as rebellion and hope, empowerment. I'm sure, like, as I say those words, you're kind of like, yeah, Hunger Games, Star Wars. Like, a lot of those have the same kind of thing at their like beating heart. And if you don't really have that in your fantasy story, it does make it less commercially viable. It makes it less marketable because it's not going to feel like it really matters when people read it. And I've kind of moved away a little bit from the original question, I guess, which was, what makes a story marketable and commercial? And the thing is, think of it more as you are getting the person to read the story. That's the first step. What makes it marketable and commercial is when they finish that story and they share it with somebody else or multiple people. That's how books take off. It's word of mouth, almost always is. That's why it's easy to astroturf books and what I mean by that is it's easy, unfortunately, sometimes for people with a lot of money to just buy so much marketing that you game the system such that you just can get a bunch of people to buy into your book and spread the word of it like inorganically. And a lot of those books tend to be piss in the wind. They just kind of come out, they make a little bit of money, and then they disappear because they weren't genuinely that great. And it was all just kind of like built on a house of cards. But when a book genuinely has the sauce and people not just read it, but are like recommending it to other people, that's the difference. That's what makes it commercially viable, because it's not just that you can spend a bunch of advertising money and get a bunch of people to read it. It's that you get a bunch of people to read it and they like it so much, they share it with others. And it's a very hard thing to do, because that's why when I was talking about in the word count episode, you're kind of hurting yourself when you make books too long, because you are making it less and less likely that people are going to finish the book, unfortunately, or even pick it up in the first place. And then if people aren't finishing the book, they are most likely not going to recommend it. Or if they do recommend it, it's going to be very like soft, caveated, like, oh yeah, I haven't finished it yet. It was cool. It was interesting. No, what you want people to do is be like, I finished this book. It was awesome. One of my favorite books of the year. And that gets people to buy it. And so that's really the heart of what I'm trying to get at. But everything that I'm talking around that in terms of like all this stuff of like the universal themes, the emotional core, all that is kind of what gets people to like a book enough to spread word of it. That angle of like, I want this to be something that feels new, but it's based on something I understand quickly and don't feel like I have to stretch my mind to grasp. And that's the key to it. I think that's the key to it. It works not just in books, but it works a lot for movies as well. I always credit Will Ashton with this kind of take, because he's the one, this insight, because Will Ashton, my co-host on Cinemaholics, when we talk about films almost every week, we used to do it every single week, but we do fewer episodes these days. But that's something that he just hangs his hat on in terms of like, yeah, that's how he tends to predict whether or not a movie is going to be successful, is like the setup of it, the premise of it, and if that's really going to resonate with people. based on everything that I've been talking about. But yeah, and I do think that like writing a story that matters, that has that social relevance, I think is such a huge thing. Like that also plays so much into word of mouth, because if people feel like what they read matters beyond, yeah, I was entertained, I turned my brain off. No, if it's more of like, I read this and I had an emotional experience, it made me think about something that I didn't understand before, or it kind of changed my perspective or altered my perspective in some way, that's what gets people talking about it, right? Even beyond just recommending it, having the gumption to search for other people's takes on it. Like, what did other people think about this book? Because I'm coming away from it with so many different opinions and stuff. And when you get a movie or a book, but especially a book that gets you thinking like that, it generates conversation and ultimately great press for your book, right? So yeah, ultimately, I think the stories that stick with us, they don't just break the mold, they reshape it. They take the mold that exists. They don't just break it. They don't just, they just move it around. They kind of do a different shape with it. And usually it's in a way that we didn't know that we wanted. It's usually changed in a way that kind of goes past a lot of the gatekeepers. There are going to be gatekeepers who say that like, oh yeah, I don't think this book's going to take off, but maybe it actually will, because they're just missing something that, is going to be very difficult to predict, because it's very difficult to predict what audiences are going to resonate with. And you don't have a ton of control over that. All you can kind of do is set out to make the story as good as you can and hope that it aligns with everything I'm talking about. But it's hard to force it if it's not really there, or if you're not really putting in the work to make it happen. And I think that these stories, like, they surprise us because they take the familiar, they turn it on its head. You're creating something that feels fresh, but it's still deeply resonating with who you actually are, who we are as a species. And if you are creating a story, I would ask yourself, like, what is the twist? What is the twist? How are you reimagining something kind of timeless that does feel fresh, that feels bold, that is undeniably yours? And that is going to be the thing that ultimately, I think, makes the difference in terms of how you actually, I was going to bring up the email, but I still have it here. That's going to be the thing that actually, if it feels yours, that you're going to feel like it genuinely, only you could have written it. And people are going to respond to that the way that they do. So, okay, now that I've hopefully answered some aspects of the question, I hope I have. I'm kind of looking at it again here, the patterns between all the stories. Yeah, I think I've laid out my theory of the case and all my caveats as is. But yeah, so let's take a look then at, these are the 10 things that Vinny says that they have detected that are patterns that their story needs. So let's go through it. Let's see if Vinny's onto something here. So number one is high stakes. Yes, high stakes are very important. I think high stakes are present in all of the examples that Vinny listed. And look at that. I went through all the different examples myself. And I think that's true. Now, it's not always the case for like cozy fantasy and things like that, but that's kind of why I don't read a ton of cozy fantasy. I like cozy slice of life anime myself, but that's kind of a different vibe, a different kind of thing. And you can have very successful stuff like Legends and Lattes, and you can't spell treason without T. Like there are examples of like this list. I'm gonna take Vinny at the benefit of the doubt that like it's not that every story has to have all these things for sure, but these are elements and patterns that they're saying that these stories tend to have. And to be fair, I can't think of a cozy fantasy that is as big as any of these. So yeah, take that for where you will. Number two, a fantastical world people desperately wish to join. Yeah, I think I got into that for sure. A magical society children believe is real and hidden somewhere out there, and logically explains the weird phenomenon in our own worlds, such as witch trials. Harry Potter, Star Wars is real, but it's just in a galaxy far, far away. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think that, again, this is something that is not necessary, but it is an element that can be there because, that doesn't really connect to Lord of the Rings. I think that we can understand Lord of the Rings more as an allegory. And again, it is a world that people do want to join. People love Tolkien's world, but it's not necessarily a place that we believe has to exist. So I think that is what Vinny is saying, to be fair. But I think also like you can have really successful fantasy that Dune is like this too, where it's not that it has to be a magical society. It can be more, I think that more underpinning thing is that, particularly in kids' stories, wish fulfillment is kind of the underpinning thing. And a magical society can be an extension of that wish fulfillment, but you can find other ways to do this that break the mold there. That it's like, what do people want the world to be like? And then you kind of flesh that out in different ways. And Star Wars might be a better kind of example of that, because the wish fulfillment of Star Wars is being able to go to all these different planets and go on this incredible adventure and do, like, that's more of a wish fulfillment thing. than it is of, a society of things that I believe, or even a fantastical world I desperately wish to join. It's also that not only do I want to join it, but I genuinely want somebody to experience this kind of adventure because it makes me feel like anything is possible. So that's kind of the element that I think is really present there. Number 4, unique/original vessel that the magic powers comes through. Wands, lightsabers, pets, Pokemon. And I think this is this is kind of in line with what I was talking about, that one thing, that iconic thing that makes your story stand out. So this is kind of what I was getting at too. It's like the Mockingjay pin, or in Dune, it's that voice, or the sandworms, actually, I'd say in Dune are more reminiscent of that. But the One Ring, it's one symbol that sums the story up. With Pokemon, it's the Pokeball, right? It's such an iconic thing. And even if you are just reading Pokemon, if Pokemon had just been a novel, the idea of like the Pokeball would have been along those lines. And then, yeah, Pikachu too. I mean, Pokemon has so many iconic things, but yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why in that trailer for the new Superman movie that James Gunn is doing, I think that's why so many people gravitated toward talking about Crypto the Superdog, because that is an example of a pet, but it's like this instantly iconic symbol of something unexpected that people immediately are like, this is the movie, right? This kind of sums up the movie for me. And that's what Gunn is doing there. That's really effective. And it's something that I don't think he did it with Guardians of the Galaxy with the Walkman, was cut like that, right? And also I would say the ship too, the Milano. But in Suicide Squad, the Suicide Squad that James Gunn did, I think that was something he kind of missed. I don't think he really had that in that movie in a similar way for whatever reason. So it's not something that he's done perfectly, I guess. Number 5, unique/original magic system. Yeah, I mean, magic systems, we have a whole episode about it. I think that if you do something really generic with a magic, that can be okay. I think, for example, Gandalf, like the way magic works in Lord of the Rings, it was unique and original for the time, but of course it's not very original anymore. But it still works these days because it's a metaphor. It's, Gandalf is like an angel kind of character, and it's more about like all the things that he can do that nobody else can do, and that's what makes him interesting. And there's a whole thing behind that. But in these days, because fantasy is so saturated, there are so many different fantasy stories that it is really important to have a magic system that does feel different. But at the same time, I think that if you do a magic system that feels too different, that is too obsessed with itself, that people are going to feel like they can't grasp onto it or totally understand it. You can't overcomplicate it, because not only does it need to be unique and original, it needs to be understandable, plausible, and it needs to really relate to the story in a good way so that you understand like why it's important, all that good stuff. Number 6, dominating a new/untapped category. So space wizards, Greek mythology, pirates, werewolves, and vampires. This one I think that I kind of get what he's saying. I mean, I hesitate with this one because I never want to think of it like I'm going to write this story because I think that people will like a story about space, or people will like a story about, I want to write it because I want to read a story about pirates. I want to read a story about this because I'm interested in it. And I think that, for example, with werewolves and vampires, if you're taking Twilight, I think that there were tons of vampire stories, tons of werewolf stories. It's not that it was an untapped category. It's that it was a familiar kind of thing. People understand vampires before Twilight, right? People, like, there were Dracula, there was tons of stuff, but it did it in a different way, right? It's not that it was an untapped category. It's that it was a category with room for potential, of which you could actually take the vampire thing and really explode it in a way that was original, even though it's not technically original, if that makes sense. And, even things like space, I mean, that was the key to Star Wars, right? Is that George Lucas was inspired by Flash Gordon, John Carter, and he wanted a movie to fill that void of like, we don't have like a space opera like this, a space fantasy out there today. But I think the only reason it really worked is because his passion was so apparent for it. You can tell that he was doing it not because he felt like this was a category that was like new, but it was more sort of like a category he felt like could be done better in a new way. So I sort of like, it's not even that I disagree with this. It's just, I think that it needs more clarification in order for us to fully like get it. Number 7, scenes and settings so iconic and cohesive they could be Lego sets. I like that. I mean, I think that that's a fun way to kind of judge your own story of like, could I do a Lego set of it? But what's the fundamental truth behind that, right? It's like, it needs it needs to have so much description and tangibility that you can sort of have this like playground that it exists in. Another way to think about it would be, would it really work for people to do fan fiction in your setting? Would they have the tools that they need to do that? Is your setting vivid and original and detailed enough that people feel like, I could not only could I be in this world, but I could build something in this world myself? Is it a sandbox, or is it just kind of like a cheaply painted set on a play that feels way more like 10 other things than its own thing? So I like that a lot. Number 8, creative/unique items and animals in the storyline that could become McDonald's toys. I mean, yeah, if we're talking about like branding and you know, I think that depends too on, I don't think even something like Fourth Wing, hugely popular, right? Even though a lot of people don't love that story, it just still, it's like one of those things that's like a guilty pleasure for a lot of people. But you could easily kind of do McDonald's toys with that because of the dragons, the sigils, the characters. It's even a book that's not that good in terms of the writing. I'm sorry if you're a fan of Fourth Wing, I'm not coming after you at all. In fact, I love you dearly. But I think that if you just remove it, if you accept the premise of like, yeah, it's not the best written book in the world. I enjoy it anyway. Not me personally, but I know plenty of people who do, and I respect and love them. But you can easily see how Fourth Wing has a marketability to it that really just helps it. You know, it's so like figured out in terms of like what it's trying to do with its items and characters that you can immediately be like, yeah, I could see a movie for this, and I could see like toys and branding coming out of it. Now, it's not necessarily like, I understand Vinny is saying this is an element of a pattern that they're seeing. It's not something you can always kind of predict or try to like, even with the Lego set thing, it's kind of, I think that's a better way to look at it because that's more about the world and kind of what you can do to make it more lived in, versus this is something that's a little bit more of like what kids want to play with toys based. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting road to go down, but it's not one that I think I would dwell on. I think that I would kind of maybe move away from that kind of thinking myself because I don't think it would help me as a writer, but I could see that it could help other people, especially if they're doing a different kind of story than I'm imagining right now, if that makes sense. And I mean, Twilight, I mean, toys with Twilight, I guess there were. Number 9, a new/unique competition, pod racing, Quidditch. Yeah, I mean, it's fun to have little competitions in your stories. You don't need them. I'd say that with Star Wars, like there wasn't really a competition in A New Hope, and that was the one that really took off. And then pod racing was in the movie that people didn't love. You know, the prequel that was kind of like, you know, it could have been better. But aside from that, I would also say too, like Quidditch is not really a thing that I think really makes or breaks Harry Potter. I think you could take Quidditch out and it still would have been huge. It's just like, it is something that helps kind of break up the story a bit. That's kind of the usefulness of it. Competitions can kind of help you reset the story. Goblet of Fire was like that. It's the 4th book and it's all based on like a big competition thing. So I do think that that's a good strategy to use just in terms of like, if you're pacing out your story and you're outlining it and you're like, you know, I feel like in the middle of the story, there's a bit of a slog. A competition can kind of break things up. It can kind of help the characters reset what's going on and kind of invigorate your story. You just have to be careful that it doesn't come out of nowhere and it feels like, or that it doesn't feel like built up or anything. But it is a cheat code. It is a way to kind of be like, ooh, suddenly this is way more exciting. Other times it can be a crutch though, so you have to be careful. Number 10, and this is the last one. Unique attire of people with powers. Percy Jackson failed to do this. The orange camp t-shirts were awful. Yeah, unique attire. I think with your books, this is definitely something that I would always be mindful of. Really try to find little details when you describe what the characters are wearing and try to do it in a way that makes sense with who they are, that people can visualize. A lot of this stuff tends to be kind of, I think, like maybe underwritten. One good example of this for sure is Mistborn. I can immediately imagine what the characters are wearing in Mistborn because Brandon Sanderson did such a good job of really tying like the Mistborn cloak and why it's important and how it ties into the magical system. And it was very unique for the time too. You can immediately visualize it, and you know it's such a cool visual of Vin using her Mistborn powers, gliding through the air, pulling toward things, and like how her cloak kind of goes with her. So that's a really good example. And in Star Wars, of course, you know, like the whole like characters wearing the robes and all of that, like the dark characters having like these really cool, you know, suits and everything. And it was taking from, you know, the fascist, you know, World War II, like the Nazis and stuff, right? So I think that whenever you're coming up with like the costumes and the attire, I think maybe try to just always tie it to how is it reflecting the characterization of the person, because you have to think of it of like, why would this person choose this to wear? Or why would this movement or organization or empire or whatever choose this to wear? And tie it to, what's interesting about them. I once wrote about these like militaristic characters, and I made it so that they wore these like helmets that had like feathers coming out on the top. And that was all to say that it's because they come from an empire that is very boisterous, that is very like, it's not about trying to win battles necessarily, it's trying to like peacock basically. And so you want to find like unique ways to just get that characterization across. And in that case, I was borrowing from real life stuff. I mean, that is something that, the Spanish Empire did, for example. So anyway, this is really good. I think that's, and then Vinny said, I mean, I could go on and on, but to say there's simply no answer is a lie or an act of ignorance/laziness. I wouldn't go that far. I think it's because people maybe they don't want to overpromise something, and they may generally just not know, or they may just generally be feeling like, it's not that they're lazy. I think it's that everything that we've talked about, there are so many exceptions to it. There are so many stories that become popular even though they suck and they don't have any of this stuff. So there are exceptions to every rule, right? But we can, to Vinny's point, recognize that a lot of the stuff that does take off, we can recognize the things that they have in common and try to get at what I was doing before. What is the underpinning reason why that resonated with people? And it's a good analysis. It's a good way to kind of like study yourself on why certain things are popular. But I want to end with this, which is that if you try to chase the trends, if you try to make your story with that in mind of like, I want this to be super popular, you have to be careful. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't understand like, here's where the market is at and how maybe I can like gear my story to be more marketable friendly. But I think if you only obsess over, I want to write the next Star Wars or Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, you will most likely fail, because you're at that point, you're not writing a story that you actually want to write. You're not writing a story that has soul in it, that is an extension of who you are. What you really want to do is you want to write the story that you want to write. You want to figure out what that story is, and then you want to be mindful and aware of what has taken off before, so those things can naturally bleed into your writing. And when you edit it and you share it with others, you can have that in mind of like, what are some things I could do to spice up my story in a way that make it more marketable? And it doesn't have to be every single thing on this list that either Vinny or I have talked about, but it should essentially try to naturally grab those things. And I think that, again, if there is one thing that your story should have almost as a non-negotiable in many, many cases, it's what I was saying over and over again. Universality through a fresh, original angle on something that feels relatable and plausible. That is, to me, the most important thing that you can do to kind of cross that hurdle of your story actually mattering for most people. And then everything else, I think, are optional negotiables, things that would be nice to haves, I guess, that you could hopefully try to make work in your story. So special thanks so much to Vinny for sending that over. I think that this was a lot of fun, and it was super cool to talk to you all on video for the first time. If you did listen to the audio version, you can pop over to the YouTube channel too if you just are curious, I guess. I'm just wearing I did choose this shirt specifically. I'm wearing now you can see it, but I'm wearing my pickleball shirt. And that was a nice little way of me saying that I don't just write, I love playing certain sports, especially pickleball. I love to run. And part of that is because my creativity comes from starting my days going outside and getting fresh air and socializing and playing a game. Pickleball is a very fun game if you haven't played it before. And then afterward, just being able to kind of decompress and get my writing done, because so much of writing comes from observation. And if you spend all your time fueling your writing only by reading, which is great, you want to read books, that's going to fuel your writing and your imagination, but you need to be in the world sometimes too. And sometimes we can get in the monotony of like, the only world I'm experiencing is like a very small group of friends that I hang out with sometimes, and my workplace, my coworkers. And that's a very limited space. Go out into the community, talk to your neighbors. When I play a game of pickleball and I'm waiting for the next game, I'm a very introverted person, but I go out of my way to try to forsake my introvertedness. And I try to talk to people, be like, hey, what's up? What's going on with you? And I try to get people's stories, I try to get characterizations from people. It sounds a little weird, actually, the way I'm describing it right now. I promise it's not as weird in practice as I'm making it sound. But that's my nice little bonus tip for you before we say goodbye. All right, thanks again for listening to the show. Thanks again to all of you who have subscribed and have been writing into the show. Very happy to be able to address at least one of the things on Vinny's list. Surely we'll get to the rest of this at another time. But yeah, if you haven't already, don't forget that you can join the Discord. Fantasy Writing for Barbarians has a channel within the In Between Drafts Discord that you can join, linked in the show notes. Our email, as always, is fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com, also in the show notes. And I'm really happy to start the week off with you all, hopefully on a strong note. So have a good rest of your week and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.